I want to rant a bit about Broken Arrow. A game that I, and most of the people now screaming bloody murder about the game, actually love. But it is also a game that is an absolute masterclass in how not to communicate with gamers. And that is the reason why the game is now sitting at mixed scores on Steam, both recently and overall, and slowly but surely trending ever downwards in the reviews. Which is quite remarkable, considering the fact that the overwhelming majority of people giving the game negative reviews have played dozens, if not hundreds of hours of it, and frequently declare their love for the game, even as they do not recommend it. How the hell does that happen? How can somebody play 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 hours of a game and still be, yeah, this is a piece of shit, don't buy it? Well, that's what makes this backlash against Broken Arrow so fascinating. When the game released a fair few weeks ago, by now, it was a massive success, especially by strategy game standards. It was the kind of success we haven't seen in the strategy gaming space for decades, especially for what is, first and foremost, a competitive online multiplayer strategy game. It was having 30,000, 40,000 people online concurrently to begin with, which is just absurd for a strategy game right now. The game still does pull in some fairly impressive numbers for a competitive strategy game in 2025, with about 8,000 to 10,000 people online at most times, which, again, really damn good. But how did this incredibly positive reception turn to a slow but steady trend downwards? It's largely because of the way the developers have chosen to interact with their community. See, there are a fair few complaints that the players had with Broken Arrow, and have had for, well, since the beta and the planning stage, and since forever, as there are several features that have become to be fairly standard in games like this that are simply not in Broken Arrow. The ability to save missions in the middle of them, for example, in single player, not there. The ability to quickly restart missions, not there. The ability to play custom skirmishes against the AI, with the AI having decks you made for it, not there. And the three biggest complaints of all that drive away by far the most people, in my opinion: one, rampant cheating for the first month of the game's release, and I mean crazy rampant cheating. Like infinite resources, infinite units, units that fire all of their weapons instantaneously like machine guns. I've seen recoilless rifles fire so fast they look like shotguns, just covering half the map. I've seen airplanes with infinite missiles. I've seen people with obvious vision hacks. And everyone has seen it again and again and again. To illustrate just how crazy the cheating was at one point, we actually have an official update from the developers on the matter of cheating and bans, as there was also no way to actually report people in-game, but 2,000 people have been banned on suspicions of cheating since launch. This was a little under a month. Again, 2,000 cheaters and a strategy game. That is an unfortunate percentage of the population right there, and it still happens. The second major complaint, which leads into the cheating problem, is no replays. In games like these, having a replay system is absolutely paramount, because games like Broken Arrow, Warno, and Wargame are all about knowledge. It is about figuring out what the enemy is doing, where he has his units, whether he can attack you, whether you should be defending, or whether you should be going on the offensive. the best way to figure out what you're doing wrong and right in this scenario is looking at the replay, so that you can see vis-a-vis your opponent what you were doing correctly and incorrectly. And in a game that again has a massive cheating problem, not having the ability to load up a replay to see whether or not the enemy managed to sneak in a sassy little sniper squad to spot all of your stuff, or if they were suspiciously constantly artillerying your stuff for another reason, just makes people even more paranoid. And the third major reason is that there is no surrender option in game. They promised that they were looking into that, but the latest patch had no updates and no implementation of surrender. And in a game where the average match is 45 minutes long and can be decided within the first 5, not having a surrender option is a pretty enormous deal in a game like this, as indeed the majority of people do not enjoy being ruthlessly fucked into the ground by a vastly superior enemy team, or one that is simply just outright cheating, for 45 minutes. And considering the game's far from perfect elo system as well, oh boy. Oh boy, oh boy indeed. Now, all of these concerns have been repeated ad infinitum at the developers time and time again, and the developers have been extremely slow in addressing it at all, in offering any sort of communication. And what inevitably ends up happening when that is the case is that the players work themselves into a frenzy. Every match where they suspect a cheater, they'll be more annoyed by the lack of a report system. Every match where they get absolutely cream-pied by vastly superior players make them more annoyed that there's no surrender option. Every time they get exposed to what appears to be terrible balancing, they get more annoyed, and with no updates, no reassurances, no communications, they only work themselves up into a greater and greater fever pitch. This is why communication is so incredibly important in these games. But then the developers did communicate a little bit, in the worst way possible. They decided to start arguing with their players. Right. So, let me explain this in the most neutral and hopefully reasonable way I can, right? Because I've seen this before, and it often leads to a phenomenon that I like to call player versus developer, where the developer gets very defensive about their game, gets very defensive about the design philosophy of it and what they want the game to be, and so they either start patching to prove the players wrong, to screw with them, or begin to argue with them. It never works out well. And Broken Arrow, in this case, put out an update stating, on balance, where they put forth their own data, showing that the faction win rate is very, very close. 49% America to 51% Russia, and also the distribution of specializations. This is after the developers have seen a lot of complaints about balancing, and they are now arguing. Hold on, it's not that bad. Let me show you the data. I can prove to you that it's not that bad. And I understand, developer. I do the urge to defend the product in this way. I get it. I absolutely do. However, you are now arguing with the players. You may think you are simply providing information. You are not. You are saying, hey, the win ratio is pretty good, therefore the balance isn't that bad. That is an argument. However, you're not actually talking with the players. You are simply lecturing them. Now, and I know it doesn't feel like that, but what happens when you've made the argument is that all of the players will want to make their counter arguments. I know, because that's how I feel too. Looking at their stats, for example, there is a very obvious issue here, where you see 49% win rate to 51% Russian, along with the ELO score, the game's in-game skill measurement system. The majority of people are relatively low elo, between 300 to 1,000. This is where Russia gets the majority of its wins, because in a straight-up confrontation, Russia's units are pretty damn good, and simply spamming huge numbers of tanks, a favorite Russian strategy, is very effective, because people at that skill level don't know yet how to deal with blobs and masses of enemy units. Then, as you get higher elo, and I know this because I am in the higher end of the bracket, or mid-end, round about 1,500 or so, the balance then changes drastically in the favor of the US. Again, I know this because I was playing the hell out of America and going, this is way too goddamn easy. Let's try the Russians and see what's up. The Russians are a million times harder, because that is the point at which the US player begins to think, okay, what is my primary strength in this game right now? Air, air, and ever more air. With the way that air power is balanced right now, the US has access to a huge number of aircraft that are very fast, very stealthy, very defensively strong, and that can wipe out the heaviest Russian tank in a single bombing run. In fact, can wipe out as many as it's able to cover with its cluster munition, and the majority of the time, get out of there as well. And even if it doesn't, the majority of these strike crafts are cheaper than the tanks they are destroying. This is where the counter to the Russian spam that is often complained about on the forums comes into play, as it doesn't matter how many low-tier tanks you spawn, a single Strike Eagle will wipe pretty much all of them, and get out as well. As at that point, the primary differential between America winning and losing is how effective and how dogged the Russian air defense network becomes, and how well they control their tanks. I have in many cases simply stopped using tanks, but I noticed the enemy is bringing massed air, and instead switched entirely to a focus on infantry and massed AAA and AA. Now, the thing there is a lot of counters to that in the game, and so the match comes down to whether or not the Russians can keep building enough AAA as the Americans are bombing it with seed, with artillery, with cluster munitions, rocket batteries, etc., and shoot down enough aircraft to make up for their losses on the ground, which the Russians will inevitably suffer, as they are now fighting Abrams tanks with near universally infantry and IFVs, because anything more expensive they put on the field is gonna get Strike Eagled immediately. And you can't afford that because the Strike Eagle costs less than the T-14. To make it even more complicated as well, the game has an upkeep system. Now, aircraft don't cost any upkeep beyond the time they spend on the map. And even whilst on the map, they only cost half upkeep. Whereas the enemy anti-air defense systems need to sit on the map all the time, costing upkeep continuously. And to have a truly effective anti-air with AA and AAA and also man-pads against helicopters on the map, you need something along the lines of 1,000 points, as preferably you want 2 batteries of long-range AAA, covered by at least 1 medium-range battery of AA, and preferably then 2 or 3 units of man-pads up front to hunt helicopters. And this is still a formation that will suffer heavy casualties from enemy seed planes, which cost slightly more than the majority of your AA and AA, but again, crucially, they don't cost upkeep, whereas all of your air defense units do. And if you don't have a massive air defense net, well, your tank is already dead the moment it gets airstriked. There is very few ways to stop the strike from going through, but at least you can then kill the aircraft that destroyed your vehicle. And with a bit of clever positioning, and the enemy being a little bit over-eager with their airstrikes, can then lead to just a mass amount of kills against enemy aircraft. Again, this is where the balance switched drastically in the direction of the United States of America, as the US factions need to actively make mistakes with their aircrafts in order to lose them. As again, with the US, I have dived AA nets like the one I mentioned, and far bigger, repeatedly, effectively, and easily, to the point where now I hunt enemy AAA positions with jets. The Special Operations deck has stealth fighters capable of carrying weapons more than adequate for killing enemy AAA batteries. And since you can also move that thing at a ridiculous speed with stealth and afterburners and countermeasures to enemy missiles, it is a rare day indeed that my F-35 fails to claim the radar system I'm sending it after, and it is a rare day indeed as well that it doesn't get out alive from doing so. But we were talking about the developers' issues, and again, this is demonstrative right here. I want to argue with the developers, because I don't agree with the developers' analysis, but since it is simply just a post, I can't argue with the developers, making me even more frustrated. So if you want to put forth data like this, it should be in a neutral fashion. Instead of putting it forth like, oh hey guys, no, seriously, it's not that bad. Look, this is the stats, the balance is actually fine. It should be presented as, oh hey, here are some incidental stats, by the way, that you guys can argue about on the forums instead of against the developers. Now, with all of that being said, is there no way back? Is there no hope for Broken Arrow? Is there no rescue for what I genuinely thought and still hope would be a major revolution in competitive strategy? Oh no, absolutely not. There is every opportunity to turn this around. The occasional review bomb need not murder a game. Helldivers has demonstrated that very, very thoroughly by now. But the developers need to adopt a very different method of communication with the audience. Less argumentative, more neutral, and for the love of God, you need to implement the basic features. The absolute basics. Replay system is a complete must. It will dispel a lot of the false positive accusations of cheating, where people will see, how the hell did how does he spot my stuff all the time? Load up the replay, oh, there was a sniper over there, and now the player has learned something about the game as well. Surrender option? Vital. Nobody likes fighting a completely obvious losing battle for 45 minutes. And yes, developer, I know that you want to argue as well now by saying, but it's not a losing battle. We've got a swing back mechanic, and you do. In fact, that's one of the best mechanics of the game, the escalation system, where you gain points for both capturing objectives and killing enemy units that increases in the game's 3 phases, meaning that even if you lose the first and second phase decisively, you still have an opportunity to come back in the third. Although that also occasionally leads to a lot of cheesing, particularly for the American side, as again, for the US, you don't need to maintain as many units on the field, as your aircraft are more than capable of munching pretty much anything and everything sent against you, and if they can't do it, an Apache longbow sure as hell can, meaning you don't need that firm of a front line, meaning you don't need that many units that cost upkeep. And since your aircraft, your primary offensive force, also don't cost any upkeep whilst they're not actively on the field, a lot of US players have realized that the best way to play is to keep a very loose front line, guarded primarily by helicopters and strike aircraft, then wait for the third round, and call in 2,000-3,000 points worth of stuff immediately, or simply nuke half the map, and then drive directly in on top of it. It leads to, in many occasions, a frustratingly slow and neutral game, where whenever the Russian side, as I've played a lot of them by now, attempt to move up, you see the Strike Eagle coming from a mile away. And I do believe this will force a certain meta change on the Russian side as well, to focus less on armor. Indeed, my best game recently with the Russians seeing a 2-1 KD was simply because I stopped building tanks. I built loads of infantry, loads of IFEs, and sat there with my enormous AA network, rebuilding it as soon as it got bombed again and again, and shooting down an endless parade of enemy air. Fortunately, because the enemy in that game didn't quite know when to bug out with their aircraft, continuously hovering directly over multiple AAA batteries. I could go into more nitty-gritty details about certain other balance issues as well, like how the Americans simply get too many toys in their armored and special forces deck to the point that why would you play anything else? Or how the Russians' two decks of mechanized and motorized feel remarkably bland and similar to one another, making everyone simply just pick armor most of the time anyways. Or how active protection systems are still probably way overtuned compared to what they should be, but that is not the point of the video. The point is to say, developers, you have something incredibly special here. You have a game that's been out for, like, what, 2 months? With 18,400 reviews. That is incredible for a strategy game in this day and age. For comparison, Company of Heroes 3, that's been out for years and has an enormous pedigree of Company of Heroes to back it up, has only 18,000. Now, the reviews don't necessarily correlate to sales directly, but it is a good indicator of sales, popularity, and how passionate your community is. And the community around Broken Arrow loves Broken Arrow. They just need you, developers, to love it as much as they do. So don't give up. Keep making the game better. Keep adding those vital features. And work a little bit on your communication strategy. And I genuinely do believe that Broken Arrow could be in the vanguard of a strategy game revolution. Anyways, that was a 22+ minute rant that nobody asked for and nobody will probably care about, but I really needed to get it off my chest. Till next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.